can my mom keep me safe? And even more so in so many of our cases, there's domestic violence or some other, there's things where people are actually getting hurt right in front of them. It feels like my mom can't keep me safe, or this person's actually, dangerous, and the person who's supposed to be taking care of me is hurting other people, and so it's very confusing. And so our goal is to restore that shield by helping the parent be the one to help the child process the trauma, feel safe again, and so that parent, builds back that capacity. Yes?
So the protective shield is really about helping the child recognize the parent's capacity. Is there any component in CPP for the parents, the trauma of losing that shield? Mm-hmm. Because as a parent, and that's your mindset, you're supposed to protect that child, so you've also lost the ability to provide that shield, and I imagine some repair might need to happen for the parent. Is that
absolutely? It's both, and I think like the way Janelle was talking about, like giving parents that confidence back to be able to be the person who the child turns to and reconnecting them. All of that is, I think CPP, because it's meant for younger children, it tends to be a lot of the work is based in play, and then there's opportunities for, like, you might have separate sessions with the parent where you talk about how they're doing and how that process is for them. Yes?
I just want to add one thing. In play, I always make the parent the protector in the game. So if there's ever a fire, I'll direct the kid to the parent. Oh, mom can put out the fire. Something like that.
If the kid asks you to tie their shoes, I think mom's better at that than me.
Mm-hmm. Putting it back on the parent. So I actually do have, the handouts that are still in the folder.
Okay, I'll pass them.
Thanks. They're just, it's just this model, which I think is this is a model from Child Parent Psychotherapy, the newer manual, where they basically talk about explaining trauma and also treatment to the child in such a way that it kind of makes sense, and you're bringing it into the room, and you're not, this doesn't mean that you necessarily have to only talk about the trauma, but to frame the treatment in a way so that the child knows that is something that they can talk about and that this is a place where they can get help with it. So basically, I'm actually gonna, I'll go to the case example, because that goes through really specifically how to use this model. Okay, just quickly, this is important because, CPP is meant to be perfect. It's meant to be at least a year-long, weekly, hour-long sessions. Like, this is way more than what we can do in BHIP. We really don't have this capacity. But there are kids that get referred to us in BHIP that don't necessarily need a year-long trauma treatment, or are going to be on a wait list for 3, 4, 5 months and are having all of these big symptoms now, and we can support those families in the short term. And so this is, when it's appropriate, it can be really useful. So some kind of things to think of, parent acknowledges the trauma. Absolutely, that needs to be, for it to be a short-term appropriate. They need to acknowledge it, the impact on the child. They need to have made some steps to basically have protected the child. If the child is still in that situation, being currently exposed to the trauma, probably not a short-term appropriate time to intervene. We want the child to be safe, and then we want the child to be having some trauma symptoms or like talking about the trauma before we bring it up. We're not going to just bring it up if it's like, oh, I think that this thing that happened to you is impacting you, when there's not a clear connection. Like, this is useful when there's a clear connection. The child saw this and is having these big nightmares, these big trauma, these big meltdowns. There's a clear connection. And then the parent's able to stay generally regulated. They might be sad, they might, get a little bit upset, but they're able to stay regulated while you're talking about the trauma. Okay, so run through this case example, which I think is a really good, just kind of way that even for older kids, you could use this model. So Emma is very smart, verbal 4-year-old. She's referred for these meltdowns that began, according to mom, around the time that her brother was born 4 months ago. During intake, mom says there was a lot of emotional and verbal abuse going on at home throughout the pregnancy. So this has been going on for much more than 4 months. Father's behavior during this time was scary, aggressive, and the child would get really scared during the interactions and say things like, I have to protect myself, I need to protect my brother. So she's clearly being affected by this. During the intake, and we were doing our best to, the child was playing and we were at a different table and definitely kind of censoring what was being talked about. That child wanted to be part of the conversation. She came over, she was actively engaged, she wanted to talk about the trauma. She was telling, sharing what happened, how she felt. And so we decided, mom and I decided that we would use the next session to basically do this, explain what happened to her. And the mom was definitely able to stay regulated, had been protective, and they had moved out of the house, so they were no longer living with dad. So this is an appropriate time to use this. Okay, so symptoms, she was having these meltdowns, she's, having had been toilet trained for years and having a lot of accidents, having nightmares, all this anxious, worried, and separation anxiety. So lots of trauma symptoms. Okay, so this is how basically we use the triangle to explain to her. So the experience. You saw dad get very angry and yell at mom, and it was very scary for you. Oh, and you definitely want to have the parents' permission about how you're wording things. And if you can get the parent to, you want them to be the one to say it. I found most parents are very nervous to do this, feel very uncomfortable. This is not a language that they speak. And so as long as they're sitting with you and you're doing it as a unified, a pair, it's okay for you to be the one to share that information. Okay, so you saw daddy get very angry and yell at mommy. It was very scary for you. Now you have trouble controlling your big feelings. Sometimes you yell or throw things. Sometimes you feel worried and you don't want to leave mom. Your mom moved you, and then the protective steps. Your mom moved you to grandma's to keep you safe so you don't see the fighting anymore. Your mom also brought you here to get help with your feelings. And then this is a place where you can learn ways to calm your body down and make sense of your feelings and what you saw. And the child listened to this whole thing, was totally engaged, and literally said, oh, nobody explained it to me.
She's 4?
She's 4. She was very smart. But it's she really needed that. She didn't know what was going on. She moved homes, all this stuff had happened. So she really needed that in the moment. And then...
the same child who had the speech issue?
No, this is a different case.
I was like...
Yes, I cured her. No, she came in very verbal. And then, that's at the stage. And then we did things that you guys all do in your work to get, trauma work. We did relaxation strategies that were appropriate for her. We helped her build up her toolkit because she was only nursing when upset. So we talked about other things she could do. We used a lot of books. There's a lot of good, trauma-informed books that are appropriate. This one, Once I Was Very, Very Scared, is a free book that you can download, and is written by one of the developers of CPP, and it's all these animals who went through scary things, and they talk about how they deal with their feelings. She had actually a lot of feelings about being sad, missing her dad, which we talked about how mom felt about that, and then also talked about ways she could stay connected. We read the Invisible String book and things she could do to stay close with dad. And then we worked on mom because she was really having more trouble than I think she let on in the beginning, and so we referred her for individual therapy, and the child had the chance to process, and she ended up, she was doing much better. Mom needed individual work. Okay, so just to finish, the pitfalls of this work, it's basically Kate started out, you want to focus on the relationship as much as possible. So always the pitfall is typically over-identifying with one or the other. So wanting to rescue the child, wanting to really over-identifying with the parent at the expense of the child. A lot of times I think feels like this mom has been through so much, but also she's not protecting this child. And so, we don't want to over-identify with either side. We want to stay as neutral as possible and help them. And then we obviously don't want to rush to correct the parent's point of view. And then not giving enough to the other things that are impacting the family. CPP is very focused on what they call attention to reality, which is like, if the family doesn't have food, start there. Don't worry about the trauma because this is the most pressing thing. Or if the family's not in a safe space, you're not reflecting. Find them a safe space. So that piece I think is very BHIP, Healthy Steps appropriate. That's what we do anyway. So those things always come first. When you have a family that are in a position where they can reflect more and get to that higher level, then it's really useful for processing more. Yeah.
I had one question because I was thinking that was a great case example. And one of the things that I immediately thought of is, do you have any strategies or would you think about it differently? I feel like for a lot of our parents, there might be a little bit less clarity in terms of how involved or what's going to happen with the father. So even if they moved out for 3 weeks, that you kind of have this inkling that this might not really be the end of that relationship, or there's a custody thing. So dad, how do you kind of navigate that?
I think that's really hard. And this child was visiting with her dad.
Right.
And I think, we talked a lot about how, mom's feelings about that. And, in CPP, there tends to be, especially if it's more in depth, there tends to be work that you have to do individually with the parent because we don't want the child to hear all those conversations.
Because even in thinking about, the idea of, in some situations we're getting definitely the perspective from the mom of how those arguments went or something like that, and then the father isn't there to be able to talk about how it was from his perspective, and you're working with the kid about what happened, but you're only really getting that idea from mom.
I think
Sorry,
we have
I asked a loaded question.
That's okay. I think you can do what Christina was talking about, where you do facilitate a connection when you know it's going to happen, and legally those questions aren't a thing.
Okay.
Otherwise, I would just explore with mom. These are options that you have to navigate that, and based on how this situation goes, we'll decide together which one you want to do.
Okay.
But you don't go for it unless it's going to be healthy for the kid. Okay, so we do have questions, but I just want to say 2 really quick things. So one thing I find in CPP is it often feels like, what am I doing? I'm stating the obvious, right? And it's this uncomfortable feeling of you want to give a family a gift and you're you threw something on the floor. And that doesn't feel like we went to psychology school to say that stuff. And I think the really important thing to remind ourselves is that this kind of work is rooted, this historically is rooted within the context of families who experience DV. That's what it was created from. And so the emphasis on creating mindfulness by stating what's going on in reality is incredibly important. So don't underestimate the value of stating what you see, because if that's not what the parent sees, then that's a really important conversation to have before you do anything else. Right? So that's critical, just for that mindfulness process. And then the last thing I want to say is just this idea of what I hope, and I think we all do, about what reflective functioning and this kind of thing is going to do for us as a team. And I made this little circle, which you can't see, and I should have put it on a slide, but it just kind of came to me, is that things that we already do, right? Tune-ups, retreats, MI, CBC, processing groups. My goal within the context of a parallel process, therapeutically, is that serves us, right? And then that serves our parents, and then that serves our patients. And the other thing I would add is that also serves our clinics. So, right, so are there moments where you can have these skills and you use them with your nurses, with your PCPs, in a team meeting, that kind of thing. So that's I think the broader picture that I'm hopeful makes sense to everybody as to why this is something I talk about all the time. Questions?
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for understanding our rushing.